You have no idea how excited I am to be making this video. Now, if you know me at all, then you know that I love the Dark Souls series. But if you don't know me, then hey, I'm Ryan Kelly, and today I'm going to be talking about Dark Souls 3. Now, why am I talking about Dark Souls 3 instead of Dark Souls Remastered or Dark Souls 2? Well, the reason for me talking about Dark Souls 3 first is because, well, I beat Dark Souls 3 first, and I've soloed every single boss first, so I thought it'd be appropriate to make my top 10 favorite Dark Souls 3 bosses. That's right, I am finally making a video about my top 10 favorite Dark Souls 3 bosses. Now, if you don't know, I love to talk about bosses. I have a show called Know Your Bosses, and I've made quite a bit of extensive top 10s talking about my favorite bosses from my favorite video games. So it only makes logical sense for me to talk about my top 10 favorite Dark Souls 3 bosses. Now, I'm going to be judging these bosses based off of their appearance, gameplay, difficulty, and creativity. And finally, this is my opinion. So if you see a boss on here that you don't like, then let me know in the comments below. And if your favorite boss doesn't make the list, then also let me know what your favorite boss is and why you like it so much. Anyway, now that we've gotten that all straightened out, let's talk about my top 10 favorite Dark Souls 3 bosses. Many people see Dark Souls 3 as one of the easiest ones in the series, which I kind of agree with after playing Dark Souls Remastered. But just because it's considered to be the easiest one in the series doesn't mean that it isn't difficult. I mean, it is a Dark Souls game after all. There are a handful of bosses that gave me a lot of trouble during my first playthrough of the game. Some were difficult because I didn't fully understand the mechanics of the game, and others were difficult because they were designed to punish the player. One boss in particular that punished me during my first playthrough just so happens to be my 10th favorite boss, being the Nameless King. Now, before you freak out, dislike this video, and comment below how the Nameless King should be higher on my list, let me explain my reasonings for doing this. For starters, I have some issues with the Nameless King. The entire first phase of the fight is kind of poorly designed in my opinion. The King of Storms can go right to hell. The way that it's designed is infuriating. Its only weak spot is its head, which is pretty high up, so you can only really hit it when it's low enough, which let me tell you is not that often. Unless of course you're a sorcerer, in which case good luck with the second phase of the fight because you'll need it. Also, the camera in this phase is especially horrible, mainly trying to lock onto the King of Storms when it's flying around and when it jumps behind you. Another thing that would keep happening to me whenever I was fighting it was that I would lock onto the Nameless King instead of the bird, which would cause me to die because the camera would get super janky. Also, its attacks are kinda cheap, especially if it's your first time fighting it. Now, I'm not saying this because I thought the King of Storms was difficult, because it really wasn't after I learned all its attacks. What I am saying is that it seems like it's intentionally designed so that you'll die to it your first few times. Not because it's difficult, but because you have no idea what's going on. However, once you finally beat the King of Storms, the real fight begins. This phase of the fight is what got the Nameless King on my list. This is one of the best fights in the game. The music is fantastic, the atmosphere is eerie, much like this boss, and the fight is really intense. He's able to use lightning and wind at his disposal, as well as a massive lance that can royally fuck you over if you get hit by it. This was by far one of the hardest fights in the game for me personally because of how much damage he would do and how hard it was to get a hit in. If you go into this fight with a mindset of trying to get as many hits in as you can, then you're not going to make it far. You really do have to be patient if you want to win this fight. You have to wait for the right moment to attack, which is not that often because of how much he attacks you. However, there are openings to attack him once you've learned more about his attack patterns. One of the most satisfying things to pull off while fighting the Nameless King is stunning him while he's charging his signature move, which might I say is one of the most visually pleasing attacks in the game. I mean, just look at it! Anyway, back to what I was saying earlier. It felt so great pulling this off, especially after how many times he killed me. And let me tell you, whenever I finally was able to kill him, it was one of the most satisfying moments in the game for me. He was actually one of the last bosses that I beat in the game because of how hard he was for me personally. However, now that I've done many playthroughs and I've gotten quite a bit better at the game, he really isn't as hard as I initially thought he was. In fact, I think he's a little overrated. But because of my memories of my first playthrough, and because I love his theme and appearance, I had to put him somewhere on my list, even if it is only number 10. During my first playthrough of Dark Souls 3, this boss was actually pretty forgettable for me personally because I actually somehow beat it on my first try. I honestly was pretty disappointed by this because I had heard how hard this boss was and how unique its fight was compared to the rest of the bosses. However, when I went back and played through the game again with an intelligence build instead of a strength build, I was able to really experience the true difficulty of the Dancer of the BOREAL Valley. Yet another boss that probably should be higher on my list, the Dancer of the BOREAL Valley is a surprisingly slow-paced fight that acts more like a dance rather than a battle, and that makes a lot of sense when you know her backstory, and well, her name is the Dancer of the BOREAL Valley after all. If you don't know what I mean by this, then let me explain. For those who don't know, every boss in Dark Souls 3 attacks in sync with the beat of their themes. So like every boss in Dark Souls 3, the Dancer's attacks are in sync with her theme. However, unlike any boss in the series, the rhythmic notation of her song isn't the standard 4/4 notation, or in simpler terms 4 quarter notes per measure, but rather a 3/4 notion, meaning that there are 3 quarter notes per measure. If you want to learn more about this, then I would highly recommend checking out Game Theory's video about the secret rhythms of Dark Souls. That aside, that is why this boss acts more like a dance rather than a battle, because the way that she attacks you follows a slower and more majestic rhythm. All of her attacks mimic her theme and her former beauty of being a dancer for Pontiff. The first time I went into this fight, I was very overpowered and didn't try to learn her moveset, but rather just attacked as much as I could before she could hit me. But when I went in as a sorcerer, I wasn't able to do as much damage and it took me longer to set up attacks, so I had to be more careful with my movements. The second time I fought her, it felt like we were performing a dance rather than just another fight, which isn't something I could say for any other boss in the series. Hell, I can't say that I've ever had an experience like this with a boss. Also, she has an amazing design. Her attacks are flashy, her blue coloration is stunning, and her lanky build and hunchback suggests that she's gone through a lot of mutations and suffering, which is true. What makes this cool is that you can figure this all out without the game telling you based on her movements, design, and cutscene. Despite everything I just said, I personally like more intense, fast-paced fights rather than dramatic, slower-paced ones better. Plus, whenever I was doing my second playthrough, this fight didn't take me nearly as long to beat as some of the other bosses on this list, which is kind of disappointing for me personally because I typically enjoy the bosses that give me more trouble. So that's why she's only number 9 on my list. Falling in love with a boss without even fighting it is something that isn't easy to achieve, especially when you're comparing it with the other classic bosses from this series. However, I will say that I instantly fell in love with this boss the moment that I saw it. Everything from its design to its method of fighting was breathtaking. And don't even get me started on its theme because holy shit, it is one of the greatest pieces of music that I've ever heard in a video game. And trust me, I don't say that kind of stuff lightly because I've heard a lot of great music in video games. So, who is this mysterious boss that has my favorite music in all of Dark Souls? Well, so far anyway, I still haven't completed Dark Souls Remastered or Dark Souls 2 as of the time of making this video. Anyway, the boss I'm referring to is the badass itself, the Dragonslayer armor. Before start to talk about the boss, let's talk about its amazing theme. It's so dramatic and really amps up the intensity of the fight and urgency of having to destroy this powerful force of nature. I feel like the theme perfectly displays the Dragonslayer armor's power. The theme's heavy and dramatic tones matches the brute strength behind each one of its attacks. Every swing that it makes is heavy and hard hitting. Now what makes this theme especially great is that it only gets better further into the fight you get, especially when you drain enough of its health to have the dragons controlling it shoot fireballs all over the arena, as well as having the Dragonslayer in hot pursuit. And that choir, that fucking choir makes this theme just that much better. This piece would still be pretty good without it, but the choir is what completes this masterpiece and makes it my favorite piece of music in Dark Souls 3. So, what do I think of the boss as a whole? Well, I like it, but I don't think it's anything special. Well, at least in Dark Souls standards anyway. For starters, I really like the design of its armor. It looks like something that would have actually existed during the medieval era. However, my favorite thing about its design is its movements, particularly with its attacks. Just look at its normal slam attack. There's so much detail with it. You can really see the weight behind each slam. It looks like the axe is really heavy and has a lot of power behind it. The same can also definitely be said about its shield slam. Overall, I think this boss is well made. It feels like the developers put a lot of time and effort into this fight. So, why do I think it's not anything special? Well, I feel like this fight is too basic. It honestly feels like a glorified NPC fight. I mean, it does become a mini boss in the Ring City DLC. Its movements aren't super diverse. One of its main attacks is eerily similar to another boss earlier in the game, being the Abyss Watcher's signature attack. Also, whenever the dragons come in, the fight does become slightly unfair, just because it's completely random when it will spam fireballs. Sometimes you can go through a fight with the dragons only attacking once, but other times they can attack 2 or 3 times in a row. Also, you can cheese this fight pretty easily if you keep circling the statue in the area. Now, of course I like this boss. I mean, it wouldn't be on my list if I didn't. Even though it looks great and feels pretty polished for the most part, I personally feel like it was missing something to make it more unique. So because of that, I can't put Dragonslayer armor any higher on my list, especially since the remaining bosses all have pretty unique mechanics. For whatever reason, my opinions about this boss can change quite a bit. I can go from loving it and being one of my favorite bosses in Dark Souls 3 to not really enjoying it that much. I honestly don't know why my opinion changes so much about this boss in particular, but despite this, I still really do like this boss. It just so happens that it can go from being one of my favorites to not even being in my top 10. However, as of right now, and because I've recently gotten a chance to fight it again, and because I think my opinions about this boss are more concrete, I can say that the Soul of Cinder is a great final boss. Now, I know this might be pretty controversial for some people, mainly the ones who've been playing Dark Souls since its release, but I have good reasoning for the Soul of Cinder not being one of my favorite bosses, and for why my opinion of him used to change so much. For starters, I played Dark Souls 3 before I went back to play Dark Souls 1 and 2, so I didn't pick up on all the references that the Soul of Cinder makes, so I'm not biased when it comes to being nostalgic with its moveset. However, I will say that the attacks that references other bosses are really interesting for sure. In fact, Soul of Cinder probably has the most diverse move pool out of all the bosses in Dark Souls 3, which makes sense considering that he's the final boss of the game. And both phases are drastically different from each other. The first one has him focusing more on doing close range combat, whereas the second one has him using more magic moves and has a bigger and longer range sword. Just something I want to point out while we're talking about his moveset. Can I just say that the Soul of Cinder has one of the most badass combos in the game? I fucking love how this looks, but I don't like getting caught in it because if you get stuck in it, then you will most likely die. I also really love his design. It's simplistic but looks intimidating, especially when he does backflips to dodge your attacks. And his sword is one of my favorites in Dark Souls. I just think it's really cool that he uses a standard bonfire sword instead of something really fancy, which makes sense considering that he's guarding the first flame. However, my biggest issue with the Soul of Cinder is that he's way too easy for a final boss. For whatever reason, I almost never have any issues beating this boss, which shouldn't be the case. I think that a final boss, especially for a Dark Souls game, should either be the hardest boss in the game, or at the very least one of the hardest ones. Now, you could argue that I just got better at the game and that's why it wasn't hard for me. While that is true, that isn't the reason why I didn't have issues with him, because I still had a lot of issues with some of the DLC bosses later on. So because I feel like this boss is a little too easy for a final boss, I can't put him any higher on my list, because one of my favorite things about Dark Souls bosses is the fact that they're really hard. Having a boss be difficult, but not to the point where it's unfair, and having to learn its moveset in order to best it is what makes these Dark Souls bosses so memorable for me. So the fact that I beat the Soul Ascender within 5 tries during my first playthrough made me not remember this boss as much as I did with other ones. This doesn't change the fact that I think Soul Ascender is a good boss and is still enjoyable, I just don't like it as much as the harder bosses in the game. Now you might be wondering why my opinion changed so much about the Soul Ascender, and the reason for that is because the more I fought the Soul Ascender, the more I realized how much detail there is in this boss fight. I mean, the polish on this fight is fantastic. It has a diverse moveset, the area where you fight him is really cool, and his music is great. And this isn't something that I really picked up on until I had fought him a few times. So because of that, my opinions on the Soul Ascender changed quite a bit, and now I can safely say that the Soul Ascender is a really good boss. It's just not one of my top 5 favorites. Dark Souls 3 has some really great DLC. It's definitely harder than most of the main game. Actually, scratch that. I would say it's harder than anything in the main game, particularly the Ring City portion of the DLC. There were so many areas that made me want to pull my hair out, like the area with all the archers or the area with the 3 angels that would never stop shooting you. However, what really made the Ring City difficult was its bosses. Now, I love every single boss in this DLC. In fact, a majority of them are on my list because they're that fucking amazing. So, which one am I going to be talking about first? Well, it's only fitting to talk about the main antagonist of the Ring City DLC, and arguably the main antagonist of Dark Souls, Slave Knight Gael. Slave Knight Gael's fight is one of the more memorable ones in Dark Souls 3 for several reasons, but the main reason is the fact that he's technically the final boss in all of Dark Souls. However, I'm not going to be focusing on that considering that it doesn't affect his placement on this list. What I want to talk about is how beautiful this fight is from start to finish. Now, the fight with Dragonslayer armor is pretty visually pleasing, but it doesn't hold a candle to how beautiful the fight with Slave Knight Gael is. First of all, his design is one of the best ones in Dark Souls with his overall appearance, moveset, and massive arena where you fight him. I mean, just look at how nice some of these attacks look. I especially love the attack where he flies in the air and homes onto you, or when he swings his cape around to create a huge storm of Dark Souls blood. However, the best looking and most intense part of the fight has to be the third phase. During this phase, Slave Knight Gael will have access to all of his attacks as well as the ability to control lightning. Not only this, but the further you get in the fight, the more intense the music gets. So when you get to the third phase and the lightning starts to spawn in, the music will pick up, which creates an amazing atmosphere, which is what I really love about this fight. I also really love the fact that all 3 phases of the fight feel like 3 different fights. The first phase is a one-on-one sword fight, whereas the second phase focuses more on a mixture of magical projectiles and sword attacks. And the third phase primarily focuses on using magical attacks. And what makes this even better is that not only does this fight look good, but it's actually really hard, being one of the hardest fights in the game. I can't even tell you how long it took me to finally be able to take Slave Knight Gael down. He has such a diverse moveset, especially during his third phase, and he's surprisingly quick for how old he is. So I really like this fight because of how intense it is, how nice it looks, and because of the challenge it gave me. However, I can't put him any higher on my list, not because I think there's an inherent problem with the fight, but rather because the remainder of the bosses on my list are some of my favorite bosses that I've ever fought, and because I have more personal memories with them. Alright, now we're getting to the bosses that I had a really hard time beating, and the ones that I consider to be some of my favorite bosses of all time. Now, this first boss just so happens to be one of the most interesting bosses in all of Dark Souls because it's not only stupid hard, but it's also unique in the sense that it's not like any other boss in the Souls series. Now, this boss isn't unique because its fight isn't designed like any other boss in the series. It's unique because it's the only boss in the series to have 3 phases with 3 different health bars. Now, if you don't know what boss I'm talking about, then you clearly haven't beaten the Ashes of Ariandel DLC and should skip this section of the video. But for those who know about the struggles of beating Sister Friede, then you'll probably know exactly why I love this boss so much.
Fret not, Father. We have no need of thy flail. 'Tis only the flame quivering at misguided ash. Please avert thine eyes. I will snuff out these ashes for good.
Let me just say that it was really hard for me to put Sister Friede this low on my list. I honestly want to put her higher on my list, but I can't, just because I really do love the remaining bosses that much. That aside, Sister Friede was by far the most difficult boss for me personally to beat in all of Dark Souls 3. It took me around a month or so to beat her. Now, I don't like Sister Friede because she's difficult, even though that does make this boss more enjoyable for me personally. I really like her because of the journey you go through when fighting her. Every phase of her fight has its own unique challenges. The first phase is a one-on-one battle between you and Sister Friede. She is able to use a range of attacks having to do with her scythe, but my favorite attack she has in her first phase is the one where she vanishes and attacks you from behind. At first I thought this attack was extremely cheap because it didn't appear to have a pattern, but this isn't true. There are clear patterns that tell how to know where she's gonna be. Once you know this, her hardest attack to avoid becomes her greatest weakness. If you're able to find her while she's invisible, you can get a free hit on her and stun her, which helps significantly with this phase. This is such a great mechanic because it can both be a way to screw the player over and a way for the player to get some free hits on Sister Friede. The second phase is completely different from the first one, mainly because there are 2 bosses being Sister Friede and Father Ariandel. Father Ariandel is way bigger and slower than Sister Friede, and instead of using ice, he uses fire, which makes for a really great fire and ice battle. And what makes his phase so creative is that you can choose to either attack Friede or Ariandel, since they both share a health bar, which hasn't been seen with any of the other double bosses that I've seen so far, like Ornstein Smo and the Demon Prince. And finally, the third phase of the fight is one of the most intense moments in all of Dark Souls. For starters, no one ever expects a third phase because it appears that Sister Friede is dead. I mean, the developers even trick us by giving us a Titanite slab and then BAM! Ariandel revived her back to life for round 3. At this point in the fight, I would almost always be pretty low on Estus flasks, which makes this part of the fight much harder. This phase is just like the first one but on steroids. This time she has the ability to use both ice and black fire, which is a deadly combination. Almost all the black fire attacks look fantastic, but my favorite one has to be where she slams her scythe on the ground to create a shockwave of black fire. This attack looks so fucking cool, and it shows off just how powerful Sister Friede really is. So yeah, I think it's safe to say that I really enjoy this fight. Now, I don't enjoy this fight purely because it's hard. I mean, that's not a good reason to like a boss. I like this fight in particular because there's so much learning involved with it. You really have to go through trial and error in order to be able to beat Sister Friede. Now, you could say this is the case with the majority of the bosses in Dark Souls 3, but I'd argue that the way to Sister Friede can be punished by her own moveset once you've learned it is unlike a majority of the bosses. My only real complaint about this fight is the arena where you fight her. It can be pretty cramped at times, especially with the second phase, and there are a lot of weird camera angles that you can get locked into, depending on where Sister Friede goes when you're locked onto her. Other than that, I really enjoyed this fight, and it definitely is one of the better fights in Dark Souls 3. Now, I'm normally not a fan of fighting two bosses at the same time, but for whatever reason, Dark Souls is really good at balancing fighting multiple bosses at a time, where it's not unfair. And it seems like every boss that has multiple bosses involved all have unique factors and mechanics that make those bosses stand out. The best example of this is of course Ornstein Smough from Dark Souls 1, but Dark Souls 3 has some really good contenders like the Demon Prince. Now, I'm actually not sure if this is a popular boss in this game because I never hear people talk about it. So if you don't like this boss, or if it is unpopular, then let me explain why I like it. For starters, the Demon Prince has a really cool mechanic with its fight. At the start of the fight, there are two different demons, being the Demon in Pain and the Demon from Below. The Demon in Pain is poisonous and the Demon from Below is fire, so depending on which one you kill first, its final form, the Demon Prince, will act differently. Now, this might sound familiar if you fought Ornstein Smough, because that's almost exactly how they act. But what makes the Demon Prince different from Ornstein Smough, in regards with the mechanics of there being two different options for its second phase, is the fact that no matter which demon you kill first, there will always be a Demon Prince, and the fact that you still need to kill both the Demon in Pain and the Demon from Below in order to summon the Demon Prince. In the case of Ornstein Smough, there will either be a buffed up Ornstein or a buffed up Smough, and you only need to kill one of them in order to activate the second phase. Now, why does this matter? Because unlike Ornstein and Smough, the Demon Prince's final form will always be the same. The only thing that changes with it is its arsenal of attacks. If you kill the Demon in Pain first, the Demon from Below will become the Demon Prince and will focus on using more long-range attacks and lasers. While if you kill the Demon from Below first, the Demon in Pain will become the Demon Prince and will focus on using meteorites. Also, something that is way better with this fight when compared to Ornstein and Smough's fight is the arena is massive, so you can't cheese the demons like you can with Ornstein and Smough, and the camera won't get caught on pillars and in corners like with the fight with Ornstein and Smough. I think this is a super cool concept and is a very clever way to reuse the mechanics of what made Ornstein and Smough such great bosses and turn it on its head. That, and I also think this is one of the most visually pleasing fights, mainly whenever it becomes a Demon Prince. Other than that, I really don't have that much more to say about this boss. It was an extremely fun fight that had some really cool mechanics and had some really nice visuals. The only other thing I will say about the Demon Prince is that this boss really didn't give me as much trouble as some of the other DLC bosses did, which is surprising, especially since there are two enemies instead of one like a majority of the bosses from the DLC. Now, I didn't plan for this to happen, but it just so happens that my number 3 spot is also another double boss. But this one is completely different from the Demon Prince because instead of having to choose which one you kill first, the second boss doesn't even show up until the second phase, like with Sister Friede's second phase. And the second boss plays a way bigger role in the fight than Father Ariandel does. And I personally think that the second phase is way more fun and difficult than the second phase of Sister Friede's fight, because instead of only having to kill one of them in order to progress, you have to kill both of them, and there's one boss you'll have to kill multiple times. I'm of course referring to the Twin Princes.
Welcome, unkindled one, purloiner of cinders. Mind you, the mantle of Lord interests me none. The fire-linking curse, the legacy of lords, let it all fade into nothing. You've done quite enough. Now have your rest.
Let me just say that I love all of the mechanics of the Twin Princes. I mean, there are so many creative mechanics in this fight that aren't seen in any of the other Dark Souls bosses that I know of. First of all, Lorien, the Elder Prince, has the ability to teleport at whim, and will do so a lot in this fight. Now, this might seem cheap at first, but again, like Sister Friede, once you figure out his patterns, you can punish him. Also, something that might help with this fight is that you can circle around him while he's attacking you, and you'll lock him from being able to teleport. Of course, this is really hard to do, and I haven't been able to do it myself. I just know that it's possible to do. Now, what makes this boss really stand out is its second mechanic. Whenever Lorien dies, Lothric the younger prince will join the fight and will resurrect Lorien to aid in killing you. And if you kill Lorien before you kill Lothric, then Lothric will revive him again, forcing you to have to kill Lorien yet again. So you're going to want to focus on killing Lothric before you kill Lorien. So on top of Lorien being able to teleport around the arena, he now is essentially invincible until you kill Lothric. I think this is such a cool and unique mechanic that I haven't seen done with any other double boss in this series, and that's why I love this boss so much. They're so creative and have a fun as hell fight that is quite a bit challenging. In fact, I would say it's the hardest fight in Dark Souls 3, excluding the DLC bosses. My only complaint with this fight is the fact that fighting Lorien after he teleports can be weird sometimes, especially when the camera will suddenly jump around or when you completely lose focus on Lorien because of the layout of the arena. Other than that, I love everything about this fight, but one of my favorite things about the Twin Princes is Lorien's greatsword. Holy shit, is this by far one of the most badass and fun weapons used in Dark Souls 3. It has a lot of power behind its swing and has some really strong fire attacks. Now, I'm not really a huge weapon guy. In other words, I will use the most basic weapons in Dark Souls and won't really branch outside my comfort zone. But as soon as I saw the design of this weapon and some of its attacks, I was convinced that I needed that weapon. Also, while we're talking about Lorien's weapon and its design, I want to just say that I love the design of both Lorien and Lothric. I love the way that Lorien moves in particular. I think that making him a cripple makes his design stand out way more, and makes the way that he fights way more memorable. And Lothric being tiny in comparison to his older brother really complements Lorien's size and power. Now I can go on talking about how I really enjoy the balance of magical attacks and melee attacks, and how I enjoy the difficulty curve of this boss. But I think I've talked long enough about the Twin Princes. We still have to cover 2 more bosses, and trust me, I have a lot to say about these 2 bosses. There is no other way to describe my number 2 choice, other than it is by far the most epic and grand fight in Dark Souls 3. It is extremely hard, fast-paced, massive, and cool as fuck. I don't think there's a boss that comes close to matching how wonderful this one is. Now, of course, it isn't my favorite boss in Dark Souls 3. I mean, it is my number 2 choice and not my number 1 choice. Even though it isn't my favorite boss in Dark Souls 3, that doesn't change the fact that Darkeater Midir is by far the most badass and powerful boss in Dark Souls 3. Now, before I start talking about why I, as well as the majority of the people who have fought Darkeater Midir, love this boss, let me just say that I love dragons, especially whenever they are bosses. So of course when I found out that this elusive secret boss that I had heard so much about was a dragon, you can bet I lost my shit. And before you ask, no, I do not like the Ancient Wyvern because that was barely even a boss fight. But that's a topic for another video. Anyway, there are several reasons why I like Darkeater Midir. For starters, I absolutely love his design. Now, I initially thought that Darkeater Midir's size was going to be an issue, but it really isn't. Now, the first thing that I should bring up when it comes to its size is that its only weak spot is its head, which is normally pretty high up. But this isn't a problem because whenever it's done with a combo, it will temporarily lower its head. So if you know its moveset, then you could take advantage of that and damage it way more often. Also, something that makes Darkeater Midir's size so deadly is the fact that it has some insane range with the majority of its attacks. So you really do have to be good at roll dodging, otherwise you're gonna die a lot. And that is not an understatement. I feel like what makes this fight so great is the fact that you have to be nearly perfect in order to kill Darkeater Midir because of how deadly most of its attacks are, and because of how much range it has. You will know every single attack that it has by the time you manage to kill it, because it will take you a long time to do, unless you're just insanely good at Dark Souls. And that's what I love about this boss. Now, I don't like this boss purely because of its difficulty. I like this boss because it really is a proper final fight to test all your skills. Well, that is if you decide to fight Darkeater Midir last like I did. I still remember how great it felt to finally take down this behemoth after grinding it for so long. because his difficulty isn't unfair like it is with so many other bosses that rely on difficulty. Also, I think that Darkeater Midir has the best design out of every boss I've seen in Dark Souls. I mean, just look at this thing. It's a dark dragon with the ability to shoot lasers that are so strong that it breaks the ground below it. Now, even though I said that Slave Knight Gael is the final boss of Dark Souls in a lore sense, I consider Darkeater Midir to be the final boss purely because it is way harder than Slave Knight Gael, and its fight is way more memorable and satisfying to beat. So with that in mind, which boss could I possibly like more than this one? I mean, it has all the qualifications of being a great Dark Souls boss and just a great boss in general. So why isn't it number 1? Well, there's a boss that I just really like. I mean, it's bad how much I enjoyed this boss. Realistically, Darkeater Midir probably should be my number 1 choice, but I can't help but love this boss in every way. Just know that Darkeater Midir is one of my favorite bosses of all time, despite the fact that it isn't my number 1 choice. Now, if you know me, or if you've seen any of my live streams, then you already know what my number 1 choice is. But for those who don't know, then let me just say that you might not expect it at all. Now, my reasons for liking this boss so much are more so for personal reasons, and because I really like this boss's main mechanic. In fact, I would argue that it is the most creative mechanic in all of Dark Souls 3, which I know is a bold statement, but I honestly can't think of a boss that has a more clever mechanic than the Abyss Watchers. Now, I realize that most of y'all probably aren't going to agree with my opinions of the Abyss Watchers, and that's fine. But let me explain why I like this boss so much, and why I think it's such a clever boss. For starters, it has, in my opinion, the best mechanics in all of Dark Souls 3, being that there can be up to 3 different Abyss Watchers fighting you at a time, and they'll keep infinitely spawning in during the first phase of the fight. And the fact that any Abyss Watcher with red eyes will focus more so on attacking other Abyss Watchers. I adore this concept. I have never seen any boss in any game do anything like this. First of all, you have no idea what to expect when entering this fight, considering that it is the first Lord Ascenders that you encounter. So when you're fighting an Abyss Watcher one-on-one, you think that's all the fight's gonna be. But the moment a second Abyss Watcher spawns in, the player becomes panicked and has to adjust their strategy accordingly. And the fact that every second Abyss Watcher to spawn in will more than likely help you out makes this fight feel unlike anything in Dark Souls. I also really like the fact that the Abyss Watchers act more like a hunter boss from Bloodborne rather than a Dark Souls boss, because I definitely am a huge fan of the hunter fights from Bloodborne. And they're even tied to each other by a blood ritual, which is definitely something that you would see in Bloodborne. Now you might be thinking, this is cool and all, but at the end of the day, this boss doesn't really stand out nearly as much as bosses like the Nameless King, Darkeater Midir, or Sister Friede, and that's completely right. Well, sort of. The Abyss Watchers are the first real challenge of Dark Souls and stand as the point where people will either love Dark Souls and continue to keep struggling to beat them, or will rage quit and give up. For me personally, the Abyss Watchers is really a special boss, because this is the boss that taught me that I couldn't just spam a boss with attacks until it died. It taught me that there was much more strategy with these bosses than I originally thought. This is the boss that really got me into Dark Souls and ultimately got me to keep playing the game. I remember I spent 2 weeks straight grinding this boss on stream, until I finally learned how to attack them and was able to beat them. So yeah, even though the Abyss Watchers might not be as enjoyable as Darkeater Midir or the Twin Princes, the Abyss Watchers is my favorite boss in Dark Souls 3 for getting me into the series and for wanting me to make videos like this one. In fact, I actually already made a pretty extensive video about the Abyss Watchers that I'll link in the description below and at the end screen if you're interested in checking that video out. Anyway, I love the Abyss Watchers to death, and I'm waiting for the day for a boss to have as much of an impact on me as this one did. Holy shit. This video took so long to make, so I hope that y'all enjoyed it, because I've been wanting to make this video for 2 years now, so the fact that I finally made it is just so satisfying. And don't worry, I will be making a video about my top 10 favorite bosses from Dark Souls 1 and from Dark Souls 2 in the future. I just need to beat those games. Realistically, you'll probably see my top 5 favorite Bloodborne bosses first before you see a top 10 about Dark Souls 1 or Dark Souls 2. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching this video. My name is Ryan Kelly, and I hope to see you in the next one. Peace.